This museum literally writes its own laws. The Smithsonian Institution is widely presented as a neutral guardian of history, a place where facts are preserved, curated, and displayed for the public good, a trusted authority, a cultural memory bank. But legally and structurally, the Smithsonian is not what most people assume it is. It is not a standard federal agency. It is not a private museum. It is not fully subject to the same transparency rules as other publicly funded institutions. It exists in a legal gray zone that very few Americans understand, and almost no one questions. The Smithsonian was founded in 1846 using money left by James Smithson, a British scientist who never visited the United States. His will instructed that his fortune be used for the increase and diffusion of knowledge. Congress accepted the bequest and created an institution unlike anything else in the country. From the beginning, the Smithsonian was structured as a trust instrumentality of the United States. That phrase sounds harmless, but it matters. It means the institution is federally supported, federally protected, but not fully federally accountable. The Smithsonian receives billions in public funding. Its leadership includes members of Congress, Supreme Court justices, and political appointees. Its museums sit on federal land. Its branding is inseparable from the authority of the U.S. government. And yet, when pressed for transparency, the Smithsonian has repeatedly argued that it is not bound by the same disclosure requirements as federal agencies. In multiple legal cases and policy statements, the Smithsonian has asserted that many of its records are not subject to the Freedom of Information Act. Requests can be denied on the grounds that materials are internal research, curatorial deliberation, donor-restricted, or simply not classified as agency records. In practice, this means that the public can see exhibits, but cannot freely examine the decisions behind them. What gets displayed? What gets archived? What gets restricted? And what quietly disappears from public view? By the Smithsonian's own estimates, more than 95% of its holdings are not on display. They are stored in warehouses, vaults, and research facilities scattered across the country. This is not unusual for museums. What is unusual is how difficult it is to determine why specific artifacts remain inaccessible. The Smithsonian does not need a national security justification to withhold material. It does not need to classify items under military law. It does not need to publicly explain its reasoning. Curatorial discretion is enough, and that discretion has fueled decades of unresolved controversy. Throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries, newspapers across the United States regularly reported discoveries of unusually large human skeletons. These reports did not come from fringe publications alone. Many appeared in mainstream local papers, often citing university researchers, state surveyors, or Smithsonian-affiliated archaeologists. Descriptions varied, but patterns repeated. Skeletons far larger than average, burial mounds containing oversized remains, bones that did not match known human proportions. Over time, these stories faded from academic discussion. The Smithsonian's modern position is clear. There is no evidence of a race of giants, and many early reports were exaggerations, hoaxes, or misidentifications. That explanation may be sufficient for some, but it leaves unanswered questions. Why were so many similar reports published independently across different states? Why were Smithsonian representatives so frequently involved in early excavations? And why do acquisition and disposition records from that era remain incomplete or inaccessible? The Smithsonian denies destroying evidence of giant remains. There is no publicly available proof that it did. But there is also no comprehensive public inventory of what was collected, reclassified, or discarded during the formative years of American archaeology. That gap is where suspicion lives, and it is not the only one. In 1909, an article published in the Arizona Gazette described the discovery of an extensive underground complex in the Grand Canyon. According to the article, the caves contained artifacts that resembled ancient Egyptian iconography, hieroglyph-like inscriptions, copper weapons, statues resembling Eastern deities. The expedition was allegedly led by an explorer associated with the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian later denied any involvement and stated it had no record of such a discovery. No follow-up expedition was publicly documented. No excavation reports were released. The story faded into obscurity. Critics argue the article was sensationalist journalism. Skeptics point out inconsistencies and the lack of physical evidence. But defenders of the mystery raise a different question. If the story was false, why was it never formally investigated or publicly debunked with documentation? Why was the response limited to denial rather than disclosure? The Grand Canyon itself complicates the issue. Large portions of it are restricted areas. Some regions are closed to the public without explanation beyond preservation and safety. Independent archaeological exploration is heavily regulated. This creates a perception problem. When access is restricted and records are sealed, denial alone does not resolve doubt. It reinforces it. The Smithsonian's defenders argue that secrecy is necessary, that premature disclosure can damage research, that artifacts must be protected from misinterpretation, that donor agreements and cultural sensitivities require discretion. All of that may be true, but institutions that shape historical narratives carry a different burden than private researchers. Their silence has consequences. Museums do not simply store objects. They define what is real, what is relevant, and what is possible. When an institution of that scale and authority chooses not to display, not to explain, and not to release records, it effectively decides which questions are allowed to be asked. The Smithsonian has also faced criticism over repatriation. For decades, Native American remains and sacred objects were held in Smithsonian collections. It was not until the passage of the Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act in 1990 that formal processes for returning these items were established. That law itself is an admission of past overreach. For years, human remains were treated as specimens rather than ancestors. Cultural context was subordinated to institutional authority. Decisions were made internally, with little public oversight. Critics argue that this mindset did not disappear overnight. It evolved. Today, the Smithsonian presents itself as transparent and inclusive. But its legal structure still allows it to operate beyond the reach of ordinary accountability. It can accept private funding with conditions. It can restrict access indefinitely. It can determine historical narratives without public challenge. And when allegations arise about giant bones, lost civilizations, or suppressed discoveries, the institution does not need to disprove them. It only needs to decline engagement. Silence, in this context, is power. There is no verified evidence that the Smithsonian is hiding proof of ancient giants or a lost Egyptian civilization in North America. That must be said clearly. But there is equally no mechanism forcing the Smithsonian to open its archives and prove the negative. That is the real issue. An institution that controls history should not rely on trust alone. Trust must be earned through transparency. And transparency requires access. When records are sealed, inventories incomplete, and decisions unreviewable, questions will persist. Not because people are irrational, but because uncertainty fills the space secrecy creates. The Smithsonian did not invent these controversies, but it sustains them by refusing to fully address them. And as long as one institution holds both the artifacts and the authority to interpret them, history will remain curated rather than complete. This is not a story about monsters or myths. It is a story about power. Who holds it? Who questions it? And who decides what humanity is allowed to remember? This government entity presents its own narratives about history and proves them through controlled release of artifacts.